Hi, and welcome back to STS 1451. Today we're going to be talking about mental illness, culture-bound syndromes, and other themes therein. Our keywords, concepts, and names include culture-bound syndrome, Lee, social contagion, mental illness, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, depression, DSM, and biopsychiatry. All of these terms can be found in your reading. I've highlighted the ones that I talk about less in lecture to make sure that you pay attention for those in your reading and make sure that you're supplementing the lecture as best as you can. How does the pre-lab, post-lab dichotomy shape our understanding of mental illness? So far we've seen how there's a pre-lab and post-lab view of things like the plague and public health in the case of Mary Mallon, but how does this rise in scientific medicine and the rise of the laboratory and the post-Flexner world affect mental illness? That's something that we're going to talk about today. Consider the following analogy between mental and physical illness postulated by medical researchers. Torrey and Miller wrote a book called The Invisible Plague, The Rise of Mental Illness from 1750 to the Present, and this quote is taken from their introduction. Insanity is an invisible plague. There are no body counts with which one can compare the present with the past. In most countries, there are remarkably few statistics that can be used to assess insanity's prevalence over time. Professional textbooks assume that insanity has always been present in approximately the same numbers as now. The textbooks seem unaware of the milieu of the mid-19th century when, according to one writer, quote, "The terror of madness and of the sinister alienist with his lunacy certificates haunted the age much like the terror of AIDS and other plagues haunt the late 20th century." So there's two analogies in here, the calling insanity an invisible plague is comparing it to plague, and then um, the sinister alienist with his lunacy certificates haunted the age much like, that simile is another analogy. The terror of AIDS and other plagues haunt the late 20th century. Why do you think Torrey and Miller accomplished by drawing an analogy between mental illness and plague? For one thing, they're showing a real fear, a fear of being diagnosed with or even catching a mental illness that arose in the 19th century that they're comparing to the fear of the AIDS crisis. We'll read more about AIDS in a few days, but you can see how that analogy helps them make it seem really frightening and urgent to think about mental illness in a new way coming into the 19th century. Another synthesizing question. Imagine a pre-lab patient with a physical illness being treated by a doctor. Now imagine a post-lab patient with the same illness. How do their experiences differ? You already thought about something similar when you compared a patient under the specificity model to the universalist model. Think about the pre-lab, post-lab, and how it maps onto what you've already written about. Now what about a pre-lab and post-lab patient with a mental illness? So although Gardner does not use the words pre-lab and post-lab, I want you to think about this question as you read or reread her piece, because that's really what she's writing about. Another synthesizing question. What does the inclusion of culture-bound syndromes in the DSM say about, that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and it's a guidebook that describes any mental illness. So what does the inclusion of culture-bound syndromes in this book say about the relationship between universalism and our understanding of mental health? Well, for one thing, it says that universalism doesn't quite fit into the realm of thinking about mental illness because there are illnesses that only manifest in certain cultures. That's something we'll think about in lecture today, but think about how that challenges the Warner as you read and watch our lecture. In 2010, a New York Times Magazine article asked a reciprocal question. What if Americans are homogenizing the experience of mental illness? I made this piece only recommended reading because I'm going to discuss a lot of it with you today, so you probably don't have to read it to understand the broad strokes of Ethan Waters' argument. Waters says, this unnerving possibility springs from recent research by a loose group of anthropologists and cross-cultural psychologists, psychiatrists. Swimming against the biomedical currents of the time, they have argued that mental illnesses are not discrete entities like the polio virus with their own natural histories. These researchers have amassed an impressive body of evidence suggesting that mental illnesses have never been the same the world over, either in prevalence or in form, but are inevitably sparked and shaped by the ethos of particular times and places. So in other words, Waters is summarizing scientists, including psychiatrists and also anthropologists, who say that universalism does not apply to mental illness, even if you have a similar diagnosis in two different cultures, the frequency with which that diagnosis is going to occur and the way that it manifests is going to be different. Except, for more than a generation now, Waters continues, we in the West have aggressively spread our modern knowledge of mental illness around the world. We have done this in the name of science, believing our approaches reveal the biological basis of psychic suffering and dispel pre-scientific myths and harmful stigma. So we see the effect of the post-lab here. Waters is talking about scientists trying to find a biological basis for any mental health disorder, and they're trying to spread their knowledge as they find it. That seems like a good thing. It's, if you learn about an illness, we should share that knowledge with other cultures and help people cope. But there is now good evidence to suggest that in the process of teaching the rest of the world to think like us, we've been exporting our Western symptom repertoire. Remember, we talked about repertoires of symptoms when we talked about nosology. That is, we've been changing not only treatments, but also the expression of mental illness in other cultures. Indeed, a handful of mental health disorders, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and anorexia among them, now appear to be spreading across cultures with the speed of contagious diseases. These symptom clusters are becoming the lingua franca of human suffering, replacing indigenous forms of mental illness. What Waters is describing here is social contagion. There are some diseases that we know have social contagion, which means they spread by word of mouth. Anorexia is one of them. The more you try to raise awareness about anorexia, the more cases you have. Suicide's another one. Popular TV shows or reports of people who've committed suicide often somehow inspire a lot more suicide, even when you're trying to do the opposite and raise awareness in order to stop it. So some mental illnesses can be spread by social contagion. And Waters is describing how this has happened across cultures. So suddenly, illnesses that were culture bound to America are appearing in other places as our scientists spread their knowledge in medical journals internationally. So this raises an interesting and pretty much unsolvable question, which is, were these illnesses already there and they just weren't being studied or discussed? Or is it genuine social contagion? It's really hard to know. Another synthesizing question: how does this hypothesis challenge our understanding of universalism or culture-bound syndromes? So how does thinking about the Americanization of mental illness change the way that we think about universalism and change the way that we think about the culture-bound syndrome? I'll leave that question to you. I will say, though, researchers have long thought about anorexia nervosa as being culture-bound, and even if it's not, bulimia nervosa does seem to be. I assigned an abstract just on this topic, just in order to show you that it's important to recognize these as culture-bound illnesses. The reason why I think it's important to recognize these as culture-bound illnesses is that the way that our first reading about culture-bound illnesses describes them, it's a very American, Eurocentric point of view that looks at illnesses that don't happen here and says like, oh, how exotic, how weird. That's what we would call orientalizing, looking at another culture and thinking like, wow, they do this weird thing over there. In contrast, culture-bound syndromes can happen anywhere, including in the US, and knowing that bulimia is culture-bound helps us think of culture-bound illnesses not as something that happens somewhere else, but as something that happens globally in different cultures. I think that's an important distinction to make. Another question: consider the issue of culture from another perspective. What happens when there's a culture clash over diagnosis and treatment? Anne Fadiman's The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down traces a real conflict between a biomedical and Hmong interpretation of epilepsy. I've taught this book for this class in previous years and students love it, but I just didn't think we could get through a book in an online version of this class. It's a lot harder to read a book when you're just on your own. So I assigned a very short synopsis of it, but I still do really recommend the book if you like to read nonfiction. The culture-bound belief, there's a question mark there because is it a culture-bound syndrome or is it just a cultural belief of Leah Lee's parents was that she was blessed with cow da pay. When the Lees did not give Leah phenobarbital, a doctor was granted a court order to take Leah from her family. This is a really interesting case of, I'm going to say medical authority. It's a little different from public health. It might remind you of the case of Mary Mallon, where doctors were able to infringe upon her individual freedoms because she was going to spread typhoid. as a healthy carrier, but in Leah Lee's case, she wasn't going to spread anything. So the state and medical institutions were able to intervene and take Leah Lee away because the parents were not complying with giving her her medicine. Fadiman gets into a lot of different reasons why they wouldn't give it to her, and a major one was just complete not understanding. They did not have Hmong interpreters there, and so not knowing what to do. But also at a fundamental level, Leah Lee's parents didn't think that she had epilepsy. They understood what was happening to her to be very different. Anthropologists and doctors still disagree if Leah's worsening seizures that eventually put her into a vegetative state were the result of her parents' failure or of a virus she could have contracted during a hospital stay. So Leah Lee's story is very tragic. It's not a book with a happy ending, but we don't know, is it really the parents to blame or going to the hospital? Was it an iatrogenic infection that she contracted while she was there? It's interesting that something medical like that could still be unknowable, because it seems like we should be able to figure out the answer, but we don't know. Where do we draw the line? Leah Lee was not an isolated case. The public health and indigenous responses to fetal alcohol syndrome also diverged radically, for example. And just to get into this, the US Public Health Service sterilized, gave hysterectomies to Native American women in order to reduce fetal alcohol syndrome. The women were not told what was happening. It did not fit with informed consent. They were told that they were getting their appendices out, and they removed their uteruses instead. Whereas the Native American Women's Health Resource Center would say that a way to address fetal alcohol syndrome would be support for alcoholism among people living in impoverished communities. So you have a social response coming from within the American Indian community, as opposed to a biomedical response, remove the uteruses, coming from the government. We tend to narrate these conflicts as being between belief and science, but medical science does include room for the unknown. Think about phenomena like the placebo effect. So we don't know why culture-bound syndromes happen. We don't know why the placebo effect works, and you could think you're taking a medicine that's really a sugar pill and genuinely get better. There are things within medical science that you just have to take a leap of faith and know it to be true. So this dichotomy between belief and science is not really entirely rigorous, and it tends to have that American Eurocentric, what we would say logocentric, or emphasizing reason over other forms of knowledge, appeal. And we have to think about what's done when we set up dichotomies in this way that are really much more complicated than just two things going on at once. These ambiguities are the reason why we are constantly changing our policies and nosologies. So the Diagnostic Statistical Manual is going to change. Our understanding of physical illnesses is constantly changing and evolving. These things feel like facts when you go to the doctor and you get diagnosed, but really they're in flux. And that's part of why having a critical lens like what we're learning in this class is really useful for people going into medical fields, because you can help to ask new questions that will change the science for the next generation. For next time, we have explored the power dynamics of culture and race and how they intersect with medical practice. Next time, we're going to be thinking about gender. I look forward to seeing what you think about our readings. I hope you have a good day.